The rain hammered against the windows of Carnegie Music Hall in Boston as 26-year-old Maya Richardson sat alone in the empty auditorium. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of the grand piano before her, but she couldn't hear the echo of her touch against the silence that had been her companion for 8 years. It was supposed to be her night. The program lying on the piano bench read, Maya Richardson. Rising Star Piano Recital, 7 p.m. But the clock now showed 8:47 p.m., and the auditorium remained empty except for her and the security guard who occasionally peeked in with sympathetic eyes. Her phone buzzed with another message from her father, Thomas Richardson, CEO of Richardson Technologies. Sorry, sweetheart. The Shanghai presentation ran long. I've wired $50,000 to your account as an apology. Buy yourself something nice. So proud of you. Maya's jaw clenched. Money. Always money. Never presents. Never the one thing she actually needed. Someone who understood what it meant to be a deaf pianist. Someone who could comprehend the mathematics and vibrations that had replaced melody in her world. She began to play anyway. Not for an audience, but because the piano was the only thing that made sense anymore. Her fingers moved across the keys with precision born of muscle memory and countless hours of practice. She couldn't hear the notes, but she felt them. Through the bench, through her bones, through the floorboards that transmitted each vibration into her body. What she didn't know was that someone was listening. Dr. James Chun hadn't planned to be at Carnegie Hall that night. The neuroscientist was supposed to be at his lab at MIT, finishing his research on sensory processing disorders. But his 11-year-old daughter, Sophie, had begged him to take her to a concert. Any concert. She'd been struggling since her mother's death a year ago, and music was the only thing that seemed to reach her anymore. They'd arrived late, only to find the main concert sold out. The ticket seller, taking pity on the disappointed child, had mentioned a free recital in the smaller hall. Probably canceled, she'd shrugged. Nobody's here. But when James and Sophie pushed open the heavy doors, they found themselves transfixed by the sight before them. A young woman in an elegant blue dress sat at the piano, playing with such intensity that it seemed to create its own gravity. The piece was complex. James recognized it as Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but something was different about the interpretation. Sophie tugged on his sleeve. Dad, why is she playing wrong? James listened more carefully. His daughter was right. The timing was slightly off. Some notes held longer than they should be. Others released too quickly. But there was something hauntingly beautiful about the imperfection. Something that made the piece feel more human, more raw. Then he noticed the small device behind the woman's ear. The hearing aid. She's deaf, sweetheart, James whispered to Sophie. But how can she play if she can't hear? It was a good question. James found himself moving closer, fascinated not just as a father, but as a scientist who studied how the brain adapted to loss. He'd read papers about deaf musicians, about how they learned to feel music through vibration, through visual cues, through mathematical precision. But he'd never witnessed it in person. When Maya finished the piece, her hands remained on the keys for a long moment. Then she turned, perhaps sensing movement, and found herself staring at the man and young girl who'd been watching her. James saw the flash of emotions cross her face. Embarrassment, defiance, resignation. He recognized that look. It was the same one Sophie wore when people treated her grief as something uncomfortable to be avoided. He did something then that surprised even himself. He began to clap, and Sophie joined him, their applause echoing through the empty hall. Maya stood, her posture defensive. She pointed to her ears and shook her head, the universal gesture that had ended countless conversations throughout her life. But James didn't retreat. Instead, he pulled out his phone and typed quickly, then held it up for her to read. That was beautiful. Your interpretation of Beethoven was unlike anything I've ever heard. Maya stared at the words, clearly surprised. She pulled out her own phone and typed back, You're my entire audience. Everyone else had better things to do. Sophie typed on her father's phone, We didn't have anything better to do. This was exactly where we wanted to be. For the first time that evening, Maya smiled. They left the concert hall together, an unlikely trio seeking shelter from the rain in a nearby coffee shop. James watched as Maya ordered through a series of written notes and gestures, the barista responding with exaggerated patience that bordered on condescension. Once seated, Maya pulled out her phone, clearly prepared for the questions that always came. But James surprised her by typing first, "I study sensory processing at MIT. I'm fascinated by how you've adapted to playing piano without auditory feedback. Would you be willing to tell me about your process?" Maya's eyebrows rose. Most people asked about her deafness with a mix of pity and curiosity about what she was missing. This man was asking about what she'd gained, how she'd adapted. She typed, "I lost my hearing at 18. Sudden sensorineural hearing loss. I was a piano prodigy before that. Everyone said my career was over. But it wasn't." Sophie typed, her young face earnest. "No, it just changed. I had to relearn everything. Music isn't just sound, it's mathematics, pattern, vibration. I taught myself to read the sheet music like a map, to feel the resonance through my body, to use visual cues from other musicians when I play in ensemble." James was captivated. "Your timing variations, they're not mistakes, are they? They're compensatory strategies." Maya looked startled. "You noticed that? Most people just think I'm playing badly." "No, you're processing differently. Without auditory feedback loops, your brain is using other sensory input to maintain rhythm. It's actually fascinating from a neurological perspective." For the first time in years, Maya felt seen not as broken, but as adapted. Not as less, but as different. Sophie had been quiet, but now she typed, "My mom died last year. Everyone treats me like I'm fragile, like I might break if they say the wrong thing. It's really lonely." The honesty in those words created a sudden intimacy among the three of them. Maya reached across the table and took Sophie's hand. She typed with her other hand, "Grief and deafness aren't the same, but the loneliness is similar. People don't know how to reach you, so they don't try. Or they try in ways that make it worse." "Exactly." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "They either avoid mentioning mom completely, or they ask how I'm doing in this weird voice like I'm a wounded animal." James felt his throat tighten. He'd been so focused on his own grief, on keeping Sophie functioning, that he hadn't fully considered how isolated she must feel among her peers. Maya continued typing, "The worst is when people make assumptions about what you need without asking you. My father throws money at everything. He's renovated my apartment, bought me the finest instruments, hired assistants. But he's never once asked me what I actually want." "Which is?" James asked. "For him to learn about my world instead of trying to pull me back into his. For him to understand that I'm not less than I was. I'm just different now." They talked until the coffee shop closed, sharing stories of isolation and misunderstanding, of well-meaning people who made things worse, of the exhaustion of always explaining yourself. When they finally parted, James found himself typing one more message. "Would you consider working with me and Sophie? I've been researching alternative therapy methods for grief processing. Music and vibration therapy show promise, but I've been missing something. I think it's perspective. Your perspective." Maya hesitated, then typed, "Why?" "Because Sophie needs to see someone who's transformed loss into something beautiful. And honestly, I think you need people who see you as complete, not broken. Maybe we can help each other." Maya looked at Sophie's hopeful face, then at James's earnest expression. She nodded. Thomas Richardson was not pleased when his daughter told him about her new project. "You're spending time with some scientist and his daughter? Maya, you should be focusing on your career. I've invested millions in your training." Maya, communicating through the video relay interpreter on screen, signed forcefully, "This is my career, Dad. James wants to document how deaf musicians process music. Could help other people like me. And what exactly is in it for you?" Are they paying you? Not everything is about money. Everything is funded by money, Maya. Don't be naive. But Maya had made her decision. 3 times a week, she met James and Sophie at his lab at MIT. The setup was unlike anything she'd experienced before. James had created a room where visual representations of sound waves were projected onto the walls, where platforms translated musical vibrations into tangible sensations, where cameras captured every subtle movement of her body as she played. I want to map exactly how you're processing music, James explained through written notes during their first session. Not to fix you or change you, but to understand you. Your brain has rewired itself in remarkable ways. Sophie was always there too, sometimes participating in experiments, sometimes just doing homework in the corner. But gradually, Maya noticed the girl opening up. She'd hum while drawing. She'd sway slightly when Maya played. Small signs of healing. One afternoon, Sophie approached Maya with a question written in a notebook. Does it make you sad that you can't hear music anymore? Maya considered carefully before writing her response. Sometimes. Mostly, I'm sad about the assumptions people make. They think my music is less valuable because I can't hear it the traditional way. But music isn't just about ears. It's about connection, emotion, expression. I can still do all of that. Do you wish you could hear again? Of course, but wishing doesn't change reality. I'd rather focus on what I can do than grieve forever about what I can't. Sophie nodded slowly. Then she wrote, I wish Mom could come back, but she can't. Maybe I need to focus on what I still have instead of what I lost. It was a breakthrough moment, and James, watching from across the room, felt tears prick his eyes. 2 months into their collaboration, James presented Maya with an opportunity that both excited and terrified her. There's a neuroscience conference in Seattle next month. I want to present our research. But more than that, I want you to perform. Show them what adapted music looks like. Maya's first instinct was to refuse. The memory of the empty concert hall still stung. Who would come? She signed to the interpreter. Scientists, researchers, students. People who understand that different doesn't mean lesser. People who will actually see what you're doing. My father will never approve. He thinks I should be performing at classical venues, trying to break back into traditional concert circles. James leaned forward, his expression intense. Maya, with respect, your father doesn't get a vote in your life anymore. You're 26 years old. You're brilliant, and you're letting his inability to adapt limit your potential. The words hit hard because they were true. Maya had spent 8 years trying to become the pianist her father remembered, trying to fit back into a world that no longer fit her. What if she stopped trying to go back and instead moved forward? I'll do it, she signed. But on one condition. Name it. Sophie performs with me. I've been teaching her to feel music the way I do. She has perfect pitch, and I think experiencing music through vibration is helping her process her grief in ways talk therapy hasn't. James looked at his daughter, who'd been listening intently. Sophie, would you want to? The girl's face lit up in a way it hadn't since her mother's death. Really? I can play with you? Maya nodded, smiling. When Thomas Richardson learned about the Seattle performance, he flew back from Singapore immediately. The confrontation happened in Maya's apartment, with the video relay interpreter working overtime to keep up with the heated argument. A neuroscience conference? Maya, you're a concert pianist, not a laboratory specimen. I'm a deaf concert pianist. Dad, that matters. You're so much more than your disability. Stop. Maya's hands cut through the air with force. Stop calling it a disability like it's something to overcome or ignore. It's part of who I am now. It shapes how I experience music, how I create music. Why can't you see that? I see my daughter throwing away her potential. No. You see your daughter not living up to your expectations. You see me as broken because I don't fit your image of what a successful musician looks like. Thomas's face reddened. I have given you everything. The best doctors, the best technology, the best opportunities. Everything except what I actually need. When was the last time you asked me what I want? When was the last time you tried to understand my world instead of trying to fix it? I'm trying to help you. Then learn sign language. The words exploded from Maya's hands. Learn about deaf culture. Come to one of my sessions with James and see what I'm actually doing instead of assuming it's beneath me. 8 years, Dad. 8 years you've had to learn to communicate with me on my terms, and you've refused because it would mean admitting that I've changed. That I'm not who I was at 18. Thomas stood frozen, his daughter's words hitting him like physical blows. I'm performing in Seattle, Maya continued, her hands trembling but determined. With or without your support. James and Sophie see me as I am and value me as I am. Can you say the same? The silence stretched between them. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough. What if I came to Seattle? Would you help me understand? Maya searched her father's face for mockery or manipulation, but found only exhaustion and something that might have been fear. You'd really come? You'd really try? I don't know sign language. I don't understand this world you're in now. But you're right, I should. I've been so focused on trying to get back what we lost that I never looked at what you gained. It wasn't a complete victory. Thomas still flinched when Maya used the word deaf instead of hearing impaired. He still struggled with the concept that his daughter's career might look different than he'd imagined. But it was a beginning. The weeks leading up to Seattle were intense. Maya and Sop Chapter 6. The confrontation he practiced for hours, developing a duet that showcased both traditional technique and adapted methods. James documented everything, fascinated by how they'd developed a visual communication system that allowed them to stay synchronized. One evening, after a particularly good practice session, Sophie asked Maya a question that had clearly been building for a while. Do you think my mom would be proud of me? Learning this way. Maya set down her water bottle and considered carefully before responding through written notes. Tell me about your mom. What did she love? Music. Art. She painted while Dad did his research. She always said that science and art weren't opposites. They were two ways of exploring the same mysteries. Then yes, Maya wrote, she'd be incredibly proud. You're exploring grief through music, through science, through art. You're using everything she taught you. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I feel like I'm forgetting her. Her voice, her smell. It's getting harder to remember. That's not forgetting, Maya wrote. That's transformation. The love doesn't disappear. It changes form. Like how I don't remember music as sound anymore, but I remember it as feeling, as mathematics, as expression. Your mom isn't gone. She's transformed into everything she taught you, everyone she loved. James, watching from the doorway, felt something shift in his chest. He'd been so focused on preserving his wife's memory exactly as it was that he hadn't considered this perspective. That memory could evolve without being lost. That night, after Sophie was asleep, James found Maya in the lab, reviewing footage of their practice sessions. Thank you, he said, making sure she could see his lips in the dim light. Maya looked up questioningly, and he typed on his ever-present tablet. For helping Sophie, for helping me see grief differently. You've given us both permission to move forward without guilt. You've done the same for me, Maya typed back. You see my deafness as a feature, not a bug. Do you know how rare that is? It shouldn't be rare. It should be normal. But it's not. Even in the deaf community, there's this divide between deaf musicians and real musicians. I don't fully fit in the deaf world because I started hearing, and I don't fit in the hearing music world anymore. I've been living in this liminal space, not quite belonging anywhere. What if you created a new space? James suggested. What if your performance in Seattle wasn't about fitting into either world, but about building a bridge between them? The idea resonated with something deep in Maya. Not a concert for the deaf community or the hearing community, but a shared experience that honored both. a demonstration that music transcended the senses through which we perceived it. The ballroom at the Seattle Convention Center was packed with over 500 attendees. Scientists, musicians, educators, and medical professionals filled the seats, curious about this unusual presentation. Backstage, Maya's hands were shaking, not from fear of performing, but from fear of being dismissed again, of being seen as a curiosity rather than an artist. Thomas appeared at her elbow, awkward in his attempt to communicate. He'd learned a few basic signs in the past weeks. Not enough for conversation, but enough to sign, "You've got this." Maya's eyes widened. It was the first time her father had signed to her in 8 years. Sophie bounced up, nervous energy radiating from every pore. "I think I'm going to throw up." Maya smiled and signed slowly, knowing Sophie had been learning. "That means you care. Channel it into the music." James gathered them together for a final moment, using a combination of speech, signs, and written notes to ensure everyone understood. He said, "This isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest, about showing people that music is bigger than they think, that human adaptation is more remarkable than they imagine. Maya, you've already proven that. Now you're just sharing it." The lights dimmed. The presentation began. James spoke first, explaining his research on sensory adaptation, on how the brain rewired itself in response to loss. He showed brain scans comparing Maya's neural activity while playing music to that of hearing pianists. The patterns were different but equally complex, equally beautiful. Then it was time for the performance. Maya walked onto the stage, elegant in black, Sophie beside her in matching attire. The grand piano waited, lit by a single spotlight. But around it, James had installed visual displays, screens that would show the sound waves of the music they played, making the invisible visible. Maya sat at the piano, and Sophie stood beside her with a violin. They began to play. The piece was one they'd composed together, a fusion of classical technique and modern experimentation. Maya's playing was precise, mathematical, but infused with emotion that transcended technical perfection. Sophie's violin wove around the piano, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in deliberate discord that resolved into unexpected beauty. On the screens around them, the sound waves danced and morphed, creating visual art from auditory experience. The audience watched, transfixed, as music became something they could both hear and see, as deaf and hearing experience merged into something new. But the most powerful moment came when Sophie set down her violin and sat beside Maya at the piano. Together, they played the final movement, a duet where their hands moved in perfect synchronization, where a deaf woman and a grieving child created something that neither could have made alone. When the final note vibrated through the room, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the applause began. But someone, Maya would never know who, started something else. The traditional deaf applause, hands raised and waving. Within seconds, the entire room was doing it, a silent ovation that Maya could see, that reached her in a way sound never could. Tears streamed down her face. Beside her, Sophie was crying too, but smiling. In the audience, Thomas Richardson was standing, his hands raised and waving awkwardly but earnestly, learning his daughter's language in real time. The presentation went viral, not because of the novelty of a deaf pianist, but because of the profound questions it raised about how we define music, about the relationship between loss and adaptation, about the spaces we create between different communities. Requests poured in. Music schools wanting to develop inclusive programs. Therapists interested in using vibration-based approaches for trauma treatment. Other deaf musicians reaching out, wanting to collaborate or share their own stories. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after Seattle, Maya received an email through her website. It was from a 15-year-old girl in Ohio who'd been deaf since birth and was being told by her school that she should give up her dream of becoming a musician. "I saw your performance. the girl wrote. I've been told my whole life that music is for hearing people, that I should focus on realistic goals. But watching you play, watching how you've created your own relationship with music, I realize they're wrong. I can do this. I just have to do it my way. Maya showed the email to James and Sophie during one of their regular sessions, which had continued even after the conference. This is what we're doing, James said. Not just research. We're changing narratives, expanding definitions. We should do more, Sophie suggested. What if we created a program, taught other people who've lost their hearing how to adapt, or taught hearing musicians how to experience music differently? The idea took root. Within months, they'd established the Adaptive Music Institute, a nonprofit organization that provided resources, training, and community for musicians navigating sensory differences. Thomas Richardson, in a move that shocked everyone including himself, became the primary funder. I'm still learning, he admitted to Maya during one of their now regular dinners. He'd hired a sign language tutor and practiced daily, determined to communicate with his daughter on her terms. But I want to understand. I want to be part of your world, not always trying to pull you back into mine. It wasn't perfect. Thomas still sometimes slipped into old patterns, still occasionally made decisions about Maya's career without consulting her. But now, when Maya called him on it, he listened. He apologized. He adjusted. 1 year after that empty concert hall performance, Maya stood on the same stage at Carnegie Music Hall. But this time, she wasn't alone. The auditorium was packed. Deaf and hearing audience members sat interspersed, visual displays installed throughout the space to make the experience accessible to all. Sophie, now 12 and remarkably poised, would be playing violin. James would be giving brief educational commentary between pieces, and Thomas would be in the front row, his hands ready to offer deaf applause. But the most significant change was in Maya herself. She no longer saw her deafness as something to overcome or compensate for. It was simply part of who she was, a deaf pianist who created music through vibration, mathematics, and emotion, not lesser than her hearing peers, not trying to imitate their approach, just different, just herself. As she walked onto the stage, Maya thought about that lonely night a year ago, the empty seats, the unanswered messages, the crushing weight of feeling unseen. Now, looking out at the full auditorium, at the faces of people who'd chosen to be here, who valued her art as it was, she felt a surge of gratitude for that empty room, because it had led to this, to James and Sophie, to her father's transformation, to the Adaptive Music Institute, to a new understanding of what music could be. She sat at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys. Sophie positioned her violin. The visual displays powered on, ready to translate their music into light and motion. Maya looked into the audience and found her father. He was smiling, his hands moving in the sign she'd taught him. I love you. I'm proud of you. Not despite who you are, but because of who you are. She signed back, thank you for learning my language. Then she began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall that night was unlike anything the venue had ever hosted. It was technically brilliant but emotionally raw. It was precise but deeply personal. It was deaf and hearing, sight and sound, loss and adaptation, grief and healing. It was Maya Richardson being exactly who she was, creating exactly the art she was meant to create. And for the first time in 8 years, that was enough. The Adaptive Music Institute now operated in 12 cities across the United States. Hundreds of musicians with various sensory differences had gone through their programs, learning not to overcome their disabilities, but to work with them, to create new forms of expression. Sophie, now 15, was developing her own research on music therapy for grief processing, combining her father's scientific approach with Maya's artistic perspective. She decided she wanted to be both a musician and a therapist, refusing to choose between the two paths. James had published groundbreaking research on sensory adaptation, with Maya as his co-author. Together, They challenged fundamental assumptions about how the brain processed music, opening new avenues for both neuroscience and music education. Thomas Richardson had become an unexpected advocate for disability inclusion in the arts, using his business connections and resources to fund accessibility initiatives across the country. He still occasionally frustrated Maya with his CEO instincts to solve problems with money, but he'd learned to ask first, to listen, to defer to her expertise about her own experience. And Maya? She continued to play, to teach, to challenge assumptions. She performed at venues that ranged from concert halls to scientific conferences to deaf community centers. She composed music that honored both her hearing past and her deaf present. She built bridges between worlds that had seemed impossibly separate. But perhaps her greatest achievement was simpler than all of that. She'd learned that being seen, truly seen, exactly as you are, was sometimes the most revolutionary act of all. And she'd created spaces where others could experience that same recognition, that same belonging, that same sense of being valued not despite their differences but because of them. On a rainy Tuesday evening, much like the one where this all began, Maya sat in an empty practice room at the Institute. She wasn't sad about the solitude. Sometimes silence was exactly what she needed. Her phone buzzed with a video call from Sophie. "Hi," the teenager signed, her fluency now almost perfect. "Just wanted to say goodnight. And thank you." "For what?" Maya signed back. "For showing me that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something new." Maya smiled. "You taught me that too, you know. All of you did. My empty concert hall wasn't an ending. It was an opening. A door I didn't even know I was walking through." They chatted for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. Then Maya returned to the piano, her fingers finding the keys with practiced ease. She played not for an audience, not to prove anything, not to overcome anything. She played simply because she could, because she loved it, because music, in whatever form it took, was her language, her expression, her joy. And in that moment, in that silence filled with vibration and meaning and connection, Maya Richardson was exactly where she belonged.